The morning sun crept across the Arizona desert like a cautious traveler, painting the rocks and scrub brush in shades of copper and gold. Sarah Whitfield stood at her cabin door, watching the light chase away the shadows that pooled in the valleys between the hills. The coffee in her tin cup had gone cold an hour ago, but she hadn't noticed. These days, she measured time not by the clock, but by the ache in her bones and the weight of silence that pressed against her ears. It had been 2 years since they'd buried Samuel in the small cemetery behind the church in Dust Rock. 2 years since the fever took him. Despite all his prayers and all his faith, the townsfolk said it was God's will. But Sarah couldn't reconcile a loving God with the cruelty of taking a man who'd spent his life tending to others. Samuel had treated Apache and white settler alike, seeing souls where others saw only skin color. Now she lived alone in this cabin 5 miles from town, surrounded by nothing but memories and the endless expanse of desert. The well needed checking. Sarah set down her cup and made her way across the dusty yard, her boots leaving prints that the wind would erase before noon. The wooden bucket sat crooked on the stone rim, and she frowned. She always left it hanging straight on its hook. Mountain cats sometimes came down for water, but they weren't known for moving buckets. As she rounded the well's far side, her breath caught in her throat. A man lay crumpled against the stones, his body folded in on itself like a broken bird. Blood had dried dark on his side, staining the earth beneath him. His hair was black as crow feathers, worn long in the Apache way, and his skin bore the deep bronze of the desert people. Sarah's first instinct was to run. Every story she'd heard in town, every warning about Apache raiders, every tale of scalped settlers rushed through her mind like a flash flood. Her hand moved to the pistol at her hip, Samuel's gun, which she'd taken to wearing since his death. But then the man groaned, a sound so full of pain and human suffering that it cut through her fear like a knife through butter. She saw how young he was, perhaps no more than 25 summers. Saw how his hand clutched at his side, trying to stem bleeding that had already slowed to a seep. Saw how his lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst. "Lord, help me," she whispered, though whether it was a prayer or a curse, she couldn't say. Sarah knelt beside him, her skirts pooling in the dust. The wound in his side was from a bullet. She could see that plain enough. The flesh around it was angry and swollen, but not yet festering. He'd been shot perhaps a day ago, maybe 2. His breathing was shallow but steady. She should leave him. She should ride to town and tell Sheriff McKenna. She should do anything but what her hands were already doing, checking his pulse, feeling his forehead for fever, examining the wound with the practiced eye of a minister's wife who'd helped her husband tend the sick for 15 years. The Apache's eyes fluttered open. They were dark as winter nights, and, for a moment, Sarah saw her death in them. Then confusion clouded his gaze, followed by pain, followed by something that might have been resignation. "Water," he said in English, the word barely a whisper. Sarah looked toward her cabin, then back at the wounded man. Once she gave him water. Once she acknowledged his humanity with that simple act of mercy. There would be no turning back. The town would never forgive her. They'd call her an Indian lover, a traitor to her race. They might do worse than call her names. But Samuel's voice echoed in her memory. "We're called to love our neighbors. Sarah." Doesn't say nothing about what color they got to be. She drew water from the well, her hands trembling only slightly as she brought the ladle to his lips. He drank slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. When he'd had enough, he leaned back against the stones. "Why?" he asked. "Because you're hurt," she said simply. "Can you walk?" He tried to push himself up and failed, sweat beading on his forehead from the effort. Sarah made her decision then, knowing it might well be the last decision she ever made. "I'm going to help you to the cabin," she said. "Lean on me." It took them nearly 20 minutes to cross the 30 yards to her door. The Apache, she refused to think of him as anything more specific, not yet, was heavier than he looked. All lean muscle and sinew. By the time she got him inside and onto her bed, both of them were breathing hard. Sarah lit a lamp and set water to boil. She gathered what medical supplies she had: clean cloth for bandages, a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds, needle and thread for stitching. Samuel had taught her well, though he'd never imagined she'd use these skills on an Apache warrior. "I need to clean the wound," she told him. "It's going to hurt." He nodded once, his jaw set. Sarah cut away his shirt, revealing a torso marked by other scars, older wounds that had healed into pale lines against his bronze skin. The bullet had passed through his side, which was good. She wouldn't have to dig it out, but the wound needed cleaning and stitching if infection wasn't to set in. She worked in silence, aware of his eyes watching her every move. He didn't cry out when she poured whiskey over the wound, though his hands clenched into fists. He didn't flinch when she pushed the needle through his skin, though sweat ran down his face like tears. "You're very brave," she said as she tied off the last stitch. "You're very foolish," he replied, his English careful but clear. "Your people will kill you for this." Sarah's hands stilled on the bandage she was wrapping. "Maybe, but that's tomorrow's worry." "I am called Nakai," he said suddenly. "It means the one who wanders." "Sarah Whitfield," she replied, then wondered why she'd given her full name to a man who might use it to bring harm to her later. "The minister's woman," Nakai said. "I know of you. Your husband helped my sister's child when the fever came. He is dead now? 2 years past. I am sorry for this. He was a good man." Sarah finished with the bandage and stood, suddenly aware of how improper this all was. An Apache man in her bed, her hands on his bare skin, the two of them alone in her cabin. If anyone from town saw— "You can't stay here," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were foolish. He couldn't walk, could barely sit up. "I mean, someone will come. They always do, checking on the widow, bringing gossip from town. I will be gone before the sun sets," Nakai said, though they both knew he was lying. Sarah busied herself making broth from the rabbit she'd caught yesterday, adding wild onions and what herbs she had. The familiar act of cooking calmed her nerves, gave her hands something to do besides shake. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and with each passing hour, the chance of discovery grew. She brought him the broth and helped him sit up to eat it. His hands shook slightly as he held the bowl. Whether from weakness or pain, she couldn't tell. "Why were you at my well?" she asked. "Tracking," he said between sips. "There are bad men, Apache, who have forgotten the old ways, who raid and kill for pleasure now, not survival. I was following them when white men shot me. They did not ask questions first. Soldiers, cowboys, drunk, angry. They saw Apache and shot." He shrugged, then winced at the movement. "It is how things are." Sarah wanted to protest, to say that not all white men were like that, but the words died in her throat. Weren't they, though? Wasn't she the exception, not the rule? Even now, she could imagine what was being said in town. The Apache had been spotted. Riders were probably forming up, checking their guns, talking about driving the savages back to the reservation or into the ground. "You should have left me," Nakai said, as if reading her thoughts. "It would be safer." "Safe isn't always right," Sarah replied, taking the empty bowl from his hands. "Rest now. Sleep if you can. I'll keep watch." She sat by the window as he slept, Samuel's rifle across her lap, watching the desert for signs of riders. The afternoon stretched long and hot, broken only by the sound of Nakai's breathing and the distant cry of a hawk. Sarah found herself thinking of the choices that had led her here, marrying Samuel against her father's wishes, following him to this hard land, staying after his death when everyone said she should go back east. And now this choice, perhaps the most dangerous of all, to show mercy to a man her people called enemy, to risk everything for someone whose name she'd learned only hours ago. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when she heard it, the sound she'd been dreading. Horses, many of them, raising dust on the road from town. Sarah stood, her heart hammering. Through the window, she could see them coming, a dozen men or more, Sheriff McKenna at their head. Someone had seen something. Someone always did. She looked back at Nakai. His eyes were open, alert despite his weakness. "They're coming," she said unnecessarily. He struggled to sit up. "Give me a gun. I will not let them take me alive." "No." The word came out harder than she'd intended. "No more killing. Not here. Not in my home." "Then what?" Sarah's mind raced. The root cellar was too obvious. The barn too open. There was nowhere to hide a wounded man that wouldn't be found by determined searchers. The horses were getting closer. She could see individual riders now, recognize faces. Tom Bradley, whose wife she'd helped birth 3 children. Jim Santos, who'd gotten drunk at Samuel's funeral and wept like a baby. Martin Fuller, who'd once tried to court her before she'd made it clear she wasn't ready for such things. And they were all coming to her home with guns and rope and hearts full of righteous anger. "Can you stand?" she asked Nakai. He tried, managing to get to his feet, though he swayed like a reed in the wind. "Good. We're going to walk out there together. You're going to lean on me, and we're going to meet them at the door. They'll shoot us both. Maybe, but if we hide and they find you, they definitely will." Sarah grabbed a shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders, then moved to support Nakai's weight. Sometimes, the only choice is to face the storm head-on. As they reached the door, Sarah paused. In a few moments, her life in this place might be over. The tolerance she'd earned as the minister's widow, the fragile acceptance she'd built over 2 lonely years, it could all burn away like morning mist. But Samuel would have opened this door. Samuel would have stood between the wounded and the angry, between mercy and vengeance. Sarah lifted her chin, tightened her arm around Nakai's waist, and opened the door to face whatever came next. The dust cloud raised by the riders hung in the air like a promise of violence. Sarah stood in her doorway, Nakai's weight heavy against her side, and watched Sheriff McKenna raise his hand to halt the group 20 yards from her cabin. The men spread out in a half circle, their hands resting on pistol grips and rifle stocks. "Afternoon, Mrs. Whitfield," McKenna said, touching the brim of his hat. He was a decent man when sober, which wasn't often these days. The badge on his vest caught the late afternoon sun. "Heard you might be having some trouble out here." "No trouble, Sheriff," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "Just tending to a wounded man, as any Christian woman would do." Tom Bradley spit tobacco juice into the dirt. "That ain't no man, Sarah, that's an Apache. Last I checked, Tom. Apache bleed red, same as you and me." Sarah said, "Or did you forget who helped deliver your youngest when Doc Patterson was too drunk to ride?" Tom's face flushed, but Martin Fuller spoke up before he could respond. "That's different, and you know it. These savages killed the Hendricks family not 2 weeks past, burned their ranch, took their scalps." "Did this man do that?" Sarah asked. "Do you see Hendricks's blood on his hands? Or are we judging all by the actions of a few now?" "Step aside. Mrs. Whitfield." McKenna's voice had lost its polite edge. "We'll take him back to town. Give him a fair trial." Nakai laughed, a bitter sound that made several men reach for their weapons. "Fair trial," he said. "Like the fair trial your people gave my uncle? They hanged him for stealing a horse he had bought and paid for." "Shut your mouth, savage," Jim Santos growled, pulling his pistol. "Put that away, Jim," Sarah snapped. "You're on my property, and I'll not have weapons drawn here." But more men were pulling their guns now, and Sarah could feel the situation spiraling beyond anyone's control. The mob mentality was taking hold, fed by fear and whiskey and stories passed around campfires. "You know what they've been saying in town, Sarah." This from Martha Fuller, Martin's wife, who had ridden out with the men. She sat side saddle on her mare, her face pinched with disapproval. "They say you've been acting strange since Samuel died, riding out alone, refusing proper suitors, keeping to yourself like you got something to hide. What I do with my time is my business, Martha." Sarah replied. "Is it? When you're harboring enemies of decent Christian folk?" Martha's voice rose shrilly. "I told Martin you'd gone queer in the head with grief. Now here's the proof of it." "The proof of what? That I helped a wounded man?" "That ain't no man," someone shouted from the back of the group. More voices joined in, growing louder, angrier. Sarah felt Nakai tense beside her. His hand moved slightly, and she realized he had a knife somewhere on his person. She pressed her arm against his, a warning to be still. "You want to know what's being said in town?" A new voice, cold and cutting. Elizabeth Carver pushed her horse through the crowd. The widow Carver, they called her now, though she'd never married. She ran the boarding house in Dust Rock and had a tongue sharp enough to flay skin from bone. "They say you were too friendly with the Apache even when Samuel was alive. They say maybe you prefer their company to decent white folks." The accusation hung in the air like a noose. Sarah understood now why the crowd was so large, why the anger ran so deep. This wasn't just about one wounded Apache. This was about her, about a woman who didn't follow the rules, who didn't remarry quick enough, who didn't hate the right people in the right way. "I prefer the company of anyone who shows basic human decency," Sarah said, "which seems to be in short supply today." "Human decency?" Tom Bradley had found his voice again. "These animals killed my brother in California, tortured him for 3 days before he died, and you're talking about decency." "I'm talking about this man," Sarah said firmly. "Not every Apache who ever lived. This wounded man who hasn't threatened anyone, who was shot without provocation while trying to protect your settlements from renegades." "So he says," McKenna interrupted. "Could be a spy, scouting for a war party. Look at him, sheriff. He can barely stand. What kind of threat is he?" "The kind that brings more of his kind down on us," Martin Fuller said. "You think they won't come looking for him? You've put every family in Dust Rock at risk with your foolishness." The crowd murmured agreement. Sarah could see the fear in their eyes now. Not just anger, fear of retaliation, fear of the unknown, fear of anything that threatened their fragile hold on this harsh land. "If you're so afraid of Apache retaliation," Nakai spoke up, his voice carrying despite his weakness, "then you should know I'm a scout for the Army. I work with Captain Morrison at Fort Buchanan. I was tracking the renegades who killed your people when your brave cowboys shot me." "Lies," Elizabeth Carver spat. "They all lie. Probably learned English just to deceive decent folks. I have papers," Nakai said, "in my saddlebags, wherever my horse is now." "Convenient, that," Jim Santos sneered. "Papers you can't produce." Sheriff McKenna held up a hand for silence. "Even if that's true, Mrs. Whitfield, you should have come to town, reported this, going behind our backs, keeping secrets. It don't look good." "I've kept him for less than a day," Sarah protested. "He needed immediate care or he'd have died. Better him than us," someone muttered. "Listen to yourselves," Sarah said, her voice rising with frustration. "Listen to what you're saying. You sound like a lynch mob, not Christian people. What would Reverend Samuel say if he could hear you now?" That gave some of them pause. Samuel Whitfield had been respected, even loved, but Martha Fuller wasn't backing down. "Reverend Samuel is dead," she said coldly, "and his widow has clearly lost her way without his guidance. Maybe it's time someone reminded her of her place." "And what place is that, Martha?" Sarah felt her temper flaring. "Silent and submissive, remarried to the first man who'd have me. Pretending I don't see the hypocrisy that lets you trade with peaceful Apache when it suits you but calls for their blood when fear takes hold. How dare you?" "I dare because it's true. Half the men here have traded with Apache bands. Tom, didn't you buy those horses from them last spring? Jim, who helped you find your son when he got lost in the desert? But now one wounded man needs help and you're ready to burn my home down around me." "Nobody said nothing about burning," McKenna said quickly, but his eyes shifted to the men carrying torches, already lit against the gathering dusk. "No? Then what are those for, Sheriff? Evening reading?" The crowd stirred uneasily. Some of them were starting to look uncomfortable with the situation, but others were growing more agitated. Sarah could see it in their faces, the moment when a crowd becomes a mob, when individual conscience drowns in collective fury. "We're taking him," McKenna decided. "One way or another. Mrs. Whitfield, you can step aside, or we can move you, but that Apache is coming with us." To a fair trial? Sarah asked bitterly. Or to the nearest tree? That's for the town to decide. The town's already decided, Nakai said quietly. I can see it in their eyes. They decided before they rode out here. Shut your mouth, savage. Jim Santos raised his pistol again. Or I'll shut it permanent. Jim, no! Sarah started to step in front of Nakai, but he held her back. Let them, he said softly. Your death would serve nothing. Go inside. Let them take me. No. You've done more than anyone would expect. More than I had right to hope for. Don't die for a stranger. You're not a stranger, Sarah said fiercely. You're a human being in need of help. That's all that matters. Touching. Elizabeth Carver's voice dripped sarcasm. The minister's widow and her Apache brave? What would your dear husband think? Sarah, his wife, throwing herself at a savage. The insult was calculated to wound, and it did. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, the situation exploded. One of the younger men, Billy Hutchins, decided to be a hero. He spurred his horse forward, reaching down to grab Nakai. The Apache, despite his wound, reacted with the instincts of a warrior. He pulled Sarah behind him and produced the knife she'd suspected he carried, holding it low and ready. Gun! Someone shouted, though it was clearly a blade. The crowd erupted. Horses reared. Men shouted. Weapons were drawn. Sarah found herself pressed against her doorframe as Nakai stood between her and the mob, swaying but determined. Stand down, McKenna shouted, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Nobody shoot. Stand down. But mob justice has its own momentum. Sarah saw Jim Santos raising his pistol, saw Tom Bradley pulling his rifle from its scabbard, saw death coming for them both in the form of frightened men with guns. Stop, she screamed. In God's name, stop! For a moment, everything froze. Then, from the back of the crowd, came the sound that would haunt Sarah's dreams for months to come, the strike of a match against leather, the hungry crackle of flame meeting torch oil. If she wants to lie with savages, a voice called out, let her burn with them. The first torch arced through the air like a falling star, trailing sparks and smoke and the promise of destruction. The torch landed short, hitting the dirt 10 feet from Sarah's door and sputtering in the dust. But it was like a signal fire had been lit. Suddenly the air filled with shouting, cursing, and the sharp smell of kerosene. Stop this madness! Sheriff McKenna tried to restore order, but his voice was drowned out by Elizabeth Carver's shrill cry. She's chosen her side. Let her face the consequences. Sarah stepped forward, leaving Nakai's protective stance. Her voice rang out clear and strong. Tom Bradley, you stand there with fire in your hand, after I sat 3 nights with your Mary when the baby wouldn't come? After I washed her body for burial when we lost them both? Tom's hand trembled on his torch. For a moment, humanity flickered in his eyes. And you, Jim Santos, Sarah continued, her gaze sweeping the mob. When your boy had the fever, who rode 20 miles to Fort Buchanan for medicine? When Doc Patterson said there was no hope, who mixed the willow bark tea that broke his fever? Jim lowered his pistol slightly, uncertainty creasing his face. Martin Fuller. I taught your daughters their letters when no teacher would come this far west. Mrs. Henderson, I held your hand when we got word about your son at Antietam. Sarah's voice grew stronger with each name. John Briggs, William Tate, Robert Crenshaw. Every one of you has eaten at my table, prayed in my husband's church, taken comfort in our home when times were hard. That was before. Martha Fuller interrupted. Before you showed your true colors, before you chose them over us. I chose compassion over cruelty. Sarah shot back. Just as Samuel would have done. Don't you dare invoke his name. Elizabeth Carver pushed her way to the front of the crowd. Samuel Whitfield was a good man, a godly man. He'd be ashamed to see what you've become, a race traitor, an Apache lover. The ugly words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt Nakai tense behind her, but she held up a hand to keep him still. You want to talk about Samuel? Sarah's voice dropped low. Dangerous. Let me tell you about my husband, the man you claim to honor. 3 years ago, A band of Apache came through during the drought. Their children were starving. You remember that, Elizabeth? You remember what you said? Let them starve. Fewer savages to worry about. Elizabeth's face flushed, but Sarah wasn't done. Samuel gave them half our stores, our food. Elizabeth, he said a child's hunger doesn't care about the color of their skin. You called him a fool then, too. Said he'd get us all killed. Sarah laughed bitterly. But those same Apache warned us about the flash flood that spring. How many lives did that save? Your boarding house would have been swept away if we hadn't known to build the levees. That's different, Martha started. Is it? Sarah rounded on her. Or what about last year, when those Confederate deserters came through? Who rode out to the Apache camp to ask for their help? Sheriff McKenna. Wasn't it you who made that bargain? Apache scouts in exchange for ammunition. They're savages when it suits you, allies when you need them, and enemies when you're afraid. The crowd stirred uneasily. Some of the torches lowered, though hatred still burned in too many eyes. None of that matters now, a new voice called out. Sarah recognized Calvin Morse, who ran the general store and cheated every customer he could. What matters is she's harboring an enemy. In wartime. That's treason. We're not at war with the Apache, Sarah said. Ain't we? Calvin pushed forward on his horse. Tell that to the Hendricks family. Tell that to every settler who's lost kin to these heathens. And how many Apache have we killed? Nakai spoke for the first time in minutes, his voice carrying despite his weakness. How many of our women and children have died at your hands? This war you speak of? Who started it? Shut your mouth. Billy Hutchins had found his courage again, bolstered by Calvin's words. You got no right to speak here. He's got the same right as any man, Sarah said firmly. He ain't a man. Elizabeth Carver's voice rose to near hysteria. He's an animal, and you're worse. At least they don't know better. But you, Sarah Whitfield, you've turned your back on your own kind. My own kind? Sarah felt years of suppressed anger boiling over. You mean the kind that whispers behind my back because I won't remarry quick enough? The kind that says I must be barren since Samuel and I had no children? The kind that watches my every move, waiting for me to fail so you can pick over my remains like vultures? How dare you? I dare because I have nothing left to lose. Sarah's voice echoed off the cabin walls. You've already decided I'm guilty. Of what? Compassion? Mercy? Following the very teachings Samuel tried to drum into your thick skulls every Sunday? Blasphemy! Martha Fuller clutched her shawl like a shield. Using scripture to defend your unnatural affections. Unnatural? Sarah laughed, wild and bitter. What's unnatural is turning healing into hatred. What's unnatural is letting fear poison your souls until you can't see humanity in anyone different from yourselves. Sheriff McKenna finally managed to push his horse between the mob and the cabin. Enough. Everyone calm down. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm asking you one last time. Step aside and let us take the Apache. We'll see he gets to Fort Buchanan. Let the army sort out his story. Liar! Nakai's voice was quiet but clear. You won't make it 2 miles before someone puts a rope around my neck. That's not... Look at them, Sheriff. Nakai gestured to the mob. Look at their faces. They've already built the gallows in their minds. It was true. Sarah could see it, the bloodlust, the righteous fury that would accept nothing less than death. These people she'd known, lived alongside, helped through hardship, they'd become strangers, twisted by fear into something ugly. You know what your problem is, Sarah? Elizabeth Carver's voice had gone cold, calculating. You think you're better than us, always have. The minister's educated wife. Too good for frontier folk. Reading your books, speaking fancy, acting like we should all bow down to your wisdom. That's not... It is, Martha Fuller joined in, sensing weakness. Even when Samuel was alive, you kept yourself apart, only mixing with us when you had to. And now we see why. You prefer the company of savages to decent white folks. I prefer the company of anyone who shows basic human kindness, Sarah said wearily, which seems in precious short supply today. Kindness? Tom Bradley had found his voice again. His grief transmuted into rage. Was it kindness when they butchered my brother? Was it kindness when they burned the Hendricks place? Was it kindness when we drove them from their lands? Sarah countered. When we slaughtered their buffalo, poisoned their water holes, broke every treaty we ever made? That's different, several voices shouted at once. Why? Because we won. Sarah's voice cracked with exhaustion and emotion. Because might makes right? Is that what you tell yourselves when you pray at night? Better than praying with heathens. Someone called out. The crowd surged forward again, and Sarah knew they were running out of time. She could feel Nakai swaying behind her, his strength failing. If violence erupted now, he wouldn't survive it, neither would she. I nursed half your children through sickness, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every ear. I've sewn your wounds, birthed your babies, closed the eyes of your dead. I've given everything to this community. And this is how you repay me? With torches and threats? For a moment, silence fell. Some faces showed shame, others confusion. But Elizabeth Carver wasn't done. You want gratitude? She hissed. For doing what any Christian woman should? You want special treatment because you did your duty? Well, here's your reward. A chance to step aside and save yourself. Last chance. Sarah, choose your own kind, or burn with the savage. Sarah looked at the faces surrounding her home. Some she'd known for years. Others were newer to Dust Rock, drawn by promises of land and opportunity. All of them carried the same sickness now, the fear that made monsters of neighbors, that turned difference into death. Behind her, Nakai whispered, Go inside. Bar the door. Let them take me. You've done enough. No, Sarah said softly. Then louder, No. If this is how it ends, I'll face it standing. She turned to look at Nakai, seeing him truly for the first time, not as Apache or enemy or symbol, but as a young man far from home, wounded and alone, facing death with dignity. Their eyes met, and in that moment, understanding passed between them. Whatever their differences, they were united now in this, two human beings standing against the storm of hatred. So be it. Elizabeth Carver raised her hand like a judge passing sentence. You've made your choice, Sarah Whitfield. Now live with it. What little time you have left. The mob pressed closer. Torches held high. Sarah gripped Nakai's arm, supporting him as he supported her. Together they faced the ring of fire closing in, while above them the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Silent witnesses to what humanity could become when fear ruled hearts and hatred guided hands. The mob pressed closer, their torches casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Sarah could feel the heat on her face, could smell the acrid smoke that promised destruction. Then, just as Billy Hutchins raised his torch to throw, a voice rang out from beyond the circle of light. Stand down, or I fire. Every head turned toward the small rise behind the cabin. There, silhouetted against the dying light, stood Nakai, but not the wounded man who'd been leaning against Sarah moments before. This was a different creature entirely. A warrior revealed, standing tall despite his injury with a Winchester rifle steady in his hands. That's my rifle, Tom Bradley shouted. He broke into my saddlebag. Borrowed, Nakai corrected, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced death before and found it wanting. Just as you borrow Apache land and call it settlement. Sheriff McKenna's hand went to his pistol. Put the weapon down. Son, you're only making this worse. Worse, Nakai laughed, though there was no humor in it. You come to burn an innocent woman's home, and I'm making it worse. Nobody's burning anything, McKenna lied, even as torches wavered in eager hands. You think I'm a fool? Sheriff. Nakai shifted the rifle slightly, not quite aiming at anyone but making clear he could. I've scouted for your army for 3 years. I've sat in your forts, heard your officers talk when they think no Apache understands English. I know exactly what happens to Indians who trust white man's justice. You're outnumbered 20-1, Cal Van Morse called out. You might get 1 or 2 of us, but you'll die just the same. Death comes to all men. Nakai replied, but I am Apache. We know how to make dying cost more than living. Sarah felt the crowd's uncertainty. A wounded man they could overwhelm. An armed warrior with the high ground was a different matter. She saw calculations in their eyes. Who would be first to fall if shooting started? Besides, Nakai continued, I won't be dying alone. He raised his voice, calling out in Apache. The words echoed across the desert, harsh and alien to the settlers' ears. What's he doing? Martha Fuller clutched her husband's arm. What's he saying? Elizabeth Carver's face had gone pale. He's calling for help. He's summoning a war party. Panic rippled through the mob. Men looked over their shoulders, peering into the gathering darkness. Every shadow could hide an Apache warrior. Every sound could herald death. There's no one out there, Sheriff McKenna said, but his voice lacked conviction. No? Nakai smiled grimly. You sure about that? Sheriff, you know how many Apache can hide in these hills? How many might be watching right now, waiting for my signal? It was a bluff. Sarah was almost certain. Nakai had been alone, wounded, barely able to walk. But the mob didn't know that. Fear was a powerful ally, and Nakai wielded it like a weapon. He's lying, Jim Santos said, but his gun hand trembled. Am I? Nakai called out again in Apache, longer this time. I am Nakai, scout for the White Father's army. I am under the protection of this woman who showed mercy when you showed none. Any who harm her or me will answer to Apache justice. Savage tricks. Elizabeth Carver spat, but she'd pulled her horse back several steps. You want to test that theory, Mrs. Carver? Nakai's rifle swung toward her. You seem eager for blood. Shall we start with yours? You wouldn't dare. Wouldn't I? You came here to burn Sarah Whitfield alive for the crime of compassion. You think I'd hesitate to defend her? Sarah stepped forward. Nakai, don't. No killing. Not for me. These people came to kill you, he said without taking his eyes off the crowd. They forfeit mercy. No. Sarah's voice was firm. That's what they expect. Savage violence. Don't give them the satisfaction of being right. Listen to her, boy. Sheriff McKenna tried to regain control. Put the gun down. We can still resolve this peaceful like you resolved it for my uncle? Nakai's voice hardened. Like you resolved it for the families at Camp Grant? 140 Apache, mostly women and children, murdered while under Army protection. Your peaceful resolutions always end with our blood in the sand. The historical reference struck home. Several men shifted uncomfortably. The Camp Grant massacre was still fresh in memory, a stain on the territory's conscience that no amount of justification could wash clean. That wasn't us, Martin Fuller protested. That was Tucson, folks. Mexicans and Papagos, led by white men. Nakai interrupted. Always led by white men who promise peace with one hand and deal death with the other. Enough history lessons. Cal Van Morse snarled. You got one rifle and one wounded Apache against 20 armed men. This ends only one way. Does it? Nakai smiled. And it was the smile of a man holding cards no one else could see. Tell me, Mr. Morse, you're a businessman. You understand numbers? How many Apache do you think are watching from these hills? None, Calvin said, but his eyes darted to the darkness beyond the torchlight. You sure? Because I count at least 10 positions where a warrior could hide. Behind that rock outcrop, in that cluster of mesquite, along that dry wash. Nakai pointed with his rifle barrel to each spot. An Apache can hit a running deer at 200 yards. How far away are those shadows, would you say? The mob collectively turned to look where he'd pointed. In the dancing torchlight, every shadow seemed to move. Every dark spot could hide death. He's bluffing. Elizabeth Carver's voice had gone shrill. There's no one out there. As if in answer, a coyote howled in the distance, then another, from a different direction, then a third. Coyotes, Tom Bradley said uncertainly. Just coyotes. In Apache country, nothing is just anything. Nakai said softly. We learned long ago to speak in nature's voice. Sarah saw the moment when fear tipped the balance. The mob had come here full of righteous fury, ready to dispense frontier justice to a lone woman and a wounded Indian. They hadn't bargained for this, an armed warrior with possible reinforcements, turning their torches into targets. "I've had enough of this," Sheriff McKenna announced. "Everyone mount up. We're going back to town." "What?" Elizabeth Carver wheeled on him. "You're going to let them win? Let her keep that savage?" "I'm going to keep the peace," McKenna said firmly, "which means not starting a war over one wounded Apache who may or may not be an Army scout." "Since when do you believe Apache lies?" Calvin Morse demanded. "Since I remembered what happened to Lieutenant Cushing's patrol when they underestimated Apache tactical planning," McKenna replied. 15 soldiers dead because they thought they were chasing 3 warriors. Turned out to be 30. "So we just leave?" Martha Fuller's voice dripped disappointment. "Let her flaunt her race betrayal." "We regroup," McKenna said. "Come back in daylight, with proper authority. If he's really an Army scout, we verify it. If not," he shrugged, "justice can wait for sunrise. Justice delayed is justice denied," Elizabeth Carver quoted primly. "Better than justice dead," McKenna countered. "Now mount up, that's an order." Slowly, reluctantly, the mob began to disperse. Some threw final glares at Sarah and Nakai. Others muttered threats and promises, but the spell was broken. Fear had conquered hatred, at least for tonight. As they prepared to leave, Sarah stepped forward one last time. "Sheriff McKenna." He turned in his saddle. "Mrs. Whitfield, when you come back tomorrow, bring Captain Morrison from Fort Buchanan. Let him verify Nakai's story. Let him see what almost happened here tonight." McKenna's face was unreadable in the torchlight. "You really believe he's a scout?" "I believe he's a man who deserves the chance to prove it," Sarah replied, "just like any of you would want in his place." The sheriff touched his hat brim. "Lock your doors tonight, ma'am. Not everyone agrees with my decision to wait." As the riders disappeared into the darkness, taking their torches and their hatred with them, Sarah felt her knees begin to buckle. The weight of what had almost happened, what might still happen, crashed over her like a flash flood. Strong hands caught her before she could fall. Nakai had descended from his perch, the rifle hanging loose in one hand as he supported her with the other. "You came out," she whispered. "Your wound, you could have torn the stitches, started bleeding again." "You stood between me and death," he replied simply. "I could do no less. That climb must have been agony. Pain passes, death is permanent." He helped her to the cabin steps, then sank down beside her, his brief show of strength finally failing. "Though I may have overstated our position." "The other Apache?" "Ghosts and shadows," he admitted with a weak smile. "But white men see Apache in every shadow when fear takes hold." Sarah laughed, surprising herself. "You learned their weaknesses well. 3 years scouting teaches many lessons." His face grew serious. "But we've only delayed them. They'll be back." "I know." Sarah looked out at the desert, now fully claimed by night. "Maybe with the Army. Maybe with more men. Maybe with legal papers to justify what they couldn't do with torches. You should leave, tonight. Take what you can carry and ride east, back to your people's lands, where a white woman alone is protected by law and custom." "This is my land now," Sarah said quietly. "Samuel is buried here. Our life together. What little we had happened here. I won't run." "Stubborn," Nakai observed. "Like Apache women. I'll take that as a compliment." Sarah stood, swaying slightly. "Come, that wound needs checking, and we both need food. Tomorrow will bring what it brings." As they made their way inside, Nakai paused at the threshold. "Why?" he asked. "Really why? Not the Christian charity answer you gave them. The truth." Sarah considered the question, then met his eyes. "Because I'm tired of hate, tired of fear, tired of watching good people turn into monsters because someone's skin is different or their God has another name. I couldn't save my husband from fever, but maybe I can save one moment from madness." Nakai nodded slowly. "That," he said, "I understand." They went inside together, barring the door against the night and whatever morning would bring. Outside. Coyotes howled again, real ones this time, and the desert wind whispered secrets that only the ancient stones remembered. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Sarah stood at her window, watching the road from town. She hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, knowing what this day might bring behind her. Nakai sat at the table, cleaning the borrowed Winchester with practiced hands. "They're coming," she said softly. Nakai joined her at the window. A dust cloud rose in the distance, larger than yesterday's. "More riders. They brought reinforcements. Or witnesses," Sarah said hopefully. "Look, there's a military escort." Sure enough, blue uniforms were visible among the civilian clothes. At least 6 soldiers rode with the townspeople, and at their head, a figure in captain's insignia. "Morrison," Nakai confirmed, relief evident in his voice. "He's a fair man for a white officer?" As the group approached, Sarah could make out individual faces. Sheriff McKenna led the civilians, with Elizabeth Carver and the Fullers close behind. But there were new faces, too. Judge Harrison from the county seat, and, surprisingly, Doc Patterson, sober for once. The riders stopped at the same distance as before, but this time Captain Morrison rode forward alone. He was a weathered man in his 40s, with the kind of face that had seen too much but still hoped for better. "Mrs. Whitfield?" He touched his hat. "I'm Captain James Morrison, Fort Buchanan. I understand there's been some dispute regarding a wounded man in your care." "Captain," Sarah nodded. "He's inside, claims to be one of your scouts." "May I see him?" Sarah glanced back at the crowd. "Just you?" "For now." Morrison dismounted, his movements careful and deliberate. "Though I should warn you, ma'am, if he's not who he claims to be, I'll have no choice but to remand him to civilian authorities." "Understood." Sarah led him inside, aware of dozens of eyes following their every move. Morrison stopped short when he saw Nakai. "Well, I'll be damned. Nakai, what the hell happened to you, son?" "Captain." Nakai stood, wincing. "Tracking Black Crow's band like you ordered. Ran into some cowboys who shot first and asked questions never—" Morrison examined the wound with practiced eyes. "Mrs. Whitfield's work. She saved my life." Nakai said simply, "Seems she's good at that." Morrison turned to Sarah. "Your husband set my broken leg 2 winters ago. Good man. I was sorry to hear of his passing." "Thank you, Captain." Sarah felt a flutter of hope. "Then you can confirm Nakai's identity?" "Oh, he's one of mine. All right. Best tracker I've got, which makes this situation complicated." Morrison moved back to the door. "Sheriff, Judge Harrison, a word inside, if you please." McKenna and the judge entered, both eyeing Nakai warily. Elizabeth Carver tried to follow, but Morrison blocked her path. "Official business, ma'am. You'll have to wait outside. I represent the concerned citizens of Dust Rock, and I represent the United States Army." Morrison cut her off. "Outside, now." When the door closed, Morrison pulled papers from his jacket. "Nakai is indeed an Army scout, employed under the Apache Scout program authorized by General Crook. Here's his commission, signed and sealed." Judge Harrison examined the documents. "These appear to be in order. However, Captain, the presence of an armed Apache, scout or not, has caused considerable alarm." "Caused by them." Nakai interrupted. "I was dying by a well. They came with torches to burn Mrs. Whitfield for helping me." "That's not exactly—" McKenna started. "Isn't it?" Sarah found her voice. "Tell the captain what happened last night. Sheriff, tell him about the mob justice you nearly allowed." Morrison's face darkened as the story unfolded. When Sarah described the torches, the threats, Elizabeth Carver's inflammatory words, his jaw tightened. "Let me understand this," he said when they finished. "Citizens of Dust Rock attempted to burn down the home of a widow, a minister's widow, because she rendered Christian aid to one of my scouts? It wasn't like that," McKenna protested. "Emotions were running high. The Hendricks massacre was perpetrated by Black Crow's renegades." Morrison interrupted. "The very band Nakai was tracking on my orders when your cowboys shot him." His intelligence might have prevented further attacks, but instead, he gestured at Nakai's wound. "How are we to know?" Judge Harrison asked. "One Apache looks much like another. Do all white men look alike to Apache?" Morrison's voice could have cut stone. "Should they shoot first and claim ignorance later?" Silence fell. Through the window, Sarah could see the crowd growing restless. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison said finally. "Nakai will return with me to Fort Buchanan for proper medical treatment. Mrs. Whitfield will receive the Army's official thanks for rendering aid to a military scout, and anyone who threatens her or her property will answer to military justice. Am I clear?" "Crystal," Judge Harrison said quickly. "Of course, this unfortunate misunderstanding was no misunderstanding," Sarah interrupted. "It was hatred, pure and simple. Hatred that would have seen me burned alive for showing mercy. Mrs. Whitfield." The judge's tone grew condescending. "Surely you can understand the settlers' fear. I understand that fear makes cowards of decent people." Sarah replied. "I understand that it's easier to hate than to think, but understanding doesn't mean accepting." "Well said," Morrison approved. "Now, shall we inform the good citizens outside?" They emerged to find the crowd pressed closer, Elizabeth Carver holding court near the well. "Mark my words, this is how it starts," she was saying. "First they're scouts, then they're neighbors, then they're—" "Mrs. Carver," Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. "A word of advice. Slander against Army personnel is actionable under military law, as is incitement to violence." Elizabeth's mouth snapped shut, but her eyes burned with undiminished hatred. Morrison addressed the crowd. "Nakai is confirmed as an Army scout under my command. His mission was to protect settlements from renegade bands. Mrs. Whitfield's actions in saving his life have possibly saved yours as well. Without his intelligence, Black Crow's raiders would strike unopposed. If he's such a valuable scout—" Calvin Morse called out. "Why was he alone? Why was he at her well?" "Because he was shot by civilians," Morrison replied coldly. "Shot while serving the very people who now bay for his blood. As for being at Mrs. Whitfield's well, would you prefer he'd died in the desert? Left his intelligence ungathered? Black Crow untracked? Better him than white folks." Someone muttered. Morrison wheeled toward the voice. "Who said that? Step forward and repeat it to my face." No one moved. "I thought not." Morrison's disgust was palpable. Cowards who threaten widows in the dark but won't own their words in daylight. "Captain Morrison," Martha Fuller spoke up, "surely you can't approve of inappropriate relationships between the races." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could speak, Nakai stepped forward. "What relationship?" he asked quietly. "I was dying. She saved me. Where is the impropriety and mercy?" "You know what people are saying," Martha insisted. "A woman alone, a savage in her home, a wounded man." Doc Patterson interrupted unexpectedly. Everyone turned to stare at the usually silent doctor. "That's what I see. A wounded man and a woman trained by her husband in healing arts. Nothing more, nothing less." "Doc," Elizabeth Carver's voice dripped disbelief. "You're defending this?" "I'm defending medicine," Patterson replied, his bloodshot eyes surprisingly clear. "Samuel Whitfield was the best healer this territory ever saw. He taught his wife well. She did what any of us should have done, what I should have done if I hadn't been too drunk to ride when word came of a wounded man." The crowd shifted uneasily. Doc Patterson's words carried weight, drunk or sober. "Furthermore," Patterson continued, "I examined the Apache, Nakai, just now. That wound would have killed him by morning without treatment. Mrs. Whitfield's actions were skilled and appropriate, professional even." "Since when do you examine patients at gunpoint?" Tom Bradley demanded. "Since when do we threaten to burn healers?" Patterson shot back. "What's next? Hanging Doc Morrison for treating Mexican vaqueros? Shooting me for setting a Chinese miner's broken leg?" "That's different," several voices protested. "Is it?" Patterson swayed slightly but held his ground. "Or is it only different when it's convenient?" Sheriff McKenna stepped forward. clearly wanting to regain control. "Folks, the matter's settled. The Apache, Nakai, is an army scout, Mrs. Whitfield broke no laws. Everyone go on home now." "This isn't over," Elizabeth Carver announced. "Army scout or not, decent people won't forget what happened here, what she chose." "You're right," Sarah said suddenly. "It isn't over, because I won't forget either. I won't forget who came with torches in the night, who spoke of burning and hanging, who let fear turn them into everything they claimed to stand against." "Threatening us now?" Calvin Morse demanded. "Remembering," Sarah corrected. "The same way you say you'll remember. The difference is, I'll remember the truth. Not some twisted version that makes you heroes instead of a mob." Captain Morrison mounted his horse. "Nakai, can you ride?" "Yes, sir." Nakai moved carefully toward a spare mount the soldiers had brought. "Mrs. Whitfield." Morrison touched his hat again. "The Army thanks you for your service. If you have any trouble at all, send word to Fort Buchanan." As Nakai prepared to mount, he turned back to Sarah. Their eyes met across the dusty yard, and in that look was everything that couldn't be said aloud. Gratitude, respect, and something deeper that had no name in either of their languages. "Thank you," he said simply. "Ride safe," she replied. The military escort formed up around him, and within minutes they were gone, leaving only dust and the bitter taste of unfinished business. The crowd began to disperse, but the muttering continued. Sarah heard the words clearly. "Indian lover, race traitor, shameful." Elizabeth Carver made one last pronouncement before leaving. "You may have won today, Sarah Whitfield, but this town has a long memory, and we know now where you stand." When they were finally gone, Sarah sank onto her porch steps, exhausted beyond measure. Doc Patterson was the last to leave, pausing beside her. "You did right," he said quietly. "Samuel would be proud." "Would he?" Sarah asked. "Or would he have found some way to help without making enemies of the whole town?" "Your husband was a good man," Patterson said. "But he was also a politician when needed, knew how to make people think his ideas were theirs. You're more direct, like medicine straight from the bottle instead of mixed with honey. And look where it's gotten me. Alive," Patterson said firmly. "Both of you. That's what matters." He started to leave, then turned back. "That Apache, Nakai, he stood between you and that mob. Not many would do that, white or Indian." Sarah nodded, remembering Nakai's silhouette against the stars, rifle steady despite his wound. "Just be careful," Patterson advised. "Elizabeth Carver's got a memory like a rattler and twice as much venom. This isn't over." As his buggy rattled away, Sarah was left alone with the morning sun and the weight of choices made. The cabin stood intact. She was alive. And somewhere riding toward Fort Buchanan was a man she'd saved who'd returned the favor. But Patterson was right. This wasn't over. In the distance, she could see the dust of Dust Rock, and she knew that every trip for supplies, every Sunday service, every casual encounter would now carry the weight of this moment. She'd chosen compassion over conformity, mercy over mob rule, and in the unforgiving arithmetic of frontier justice, that made her the enemy. The afternoon sun hung like a brass disk in the cloudless sky when Sarah heard it, the distant call of a cavalry bugle echoing across the desert. She'd been mending a torn shirt, trying to pretend life could return to normal after the events of 2 days past. The needle stilled in her hands as the sound came again, urgent and unmistakable. She stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes. To the south, dust rose in great billowing clouds, too much dust for a patrol, too organized for a cattle drive. Her blood ran cold as understanding dawned. The thunder of hoofbeats grew louder, and soon she could make out individual riders, Apache warriors, dozens of them, moving with deadly purpose toward Dust Rock. At their head rode a figure in traditional war dress, feathers streaming from his lance. "Black Crow," she breathed. The renegade Nakai had been tracking. Even as she watched, the war party split like a river around a stone. one group continuing toward town, while another wheeled toward her isolated cabin. Sarah's hands moved without conscious thought, barring the door, checking Samuel's rifle, counting ammunition. Not enough. Never enough against what was coming. The smaller band of warriors stopped just beyond rifle range, their horses dancing with barely contained energy. One rider came forward alone, and Sarah's heart hammered as she recognized the cruel intelligence in his face. This was Black Crow himself. White woman. His English was accented but clear. "You harbor the traitor Nakai?" Sarah stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand but not raised. "He's gone, taken to Fort Buchanan." Black Crow's eyes narrowed. "The scouts say different. Say he hides here still, protected by white woman's magic. Your scouts are wrong." Sarah kept her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her throat. "The army took him yesterday? Army." Black Crow spat the word like a curse. "Nakai wears their blue coat. Forgets he is Apache, leads them to our camps, our families. For this, he dies." "He's not here," Sarah repeated. "Search if you don't believe me." Black Crow studied her for a long moment, then smiled. It was not a comforting expression. "You speak truth, maybe, but you helped him, gave him sanctuary when he deserved death. For this." He gestured toward Dust Rock, where smoke was beginning to rise. "Your people will pay." The distant crack of rifle fire drifted across the desert. Sarah's stomach clenched as she imagined the scene in town, warriors striking fast and hard, catching the settlement unprepared despite all their vigilance against savage attacks. "They did nothing," she said desperately. "If you want revenge on someone, take it on me. I'm the one who helped Nakai." "You?" Black Crow laughed, a sound like winter wind. "White woman thinks she is important? No, you are nothing. But your people, they will remember this day. Remember that their hatred brought death to their doors." More gunfire. Closer now. Some of the warriors with Black Crow grew restless, eager to join the fighting, but their leader held up a hand, still watching Sarah with those cold, intelligent eyes. "You know what is funny?" he said conversationally, as if they were discussing weather. "Your people came here with torches, yes, to burn you for helping Apache. Now Apache come with torches for them. The spirits laugh at such justice." "Please," Sarah found herself begging. "There are children in that town, innocent people who had nothing to do with—" "Innocent?" Black Crow's voice hardened. "Were my children innocent when your soldiers burned our winter camp? Was my sister innocent when your innocent settlers shot her gathering pine nuts?" He leaned forward in his saddle. "There are no innocents in war. White woman, your people taught us that." A warrior rode up fast from the direction of town, speaking rapidly in Apache. Black Crow listened, then barked orders. Most of his band wheeled and galloped toward the fighting, leaving only 3 warriors to watch Sarah. "It seems your people fight better than expected," Black Crow said. "Some soldiers were visiting. They make things interesting." His smile returned. "No matter. We have other business first." He produced something from his saddlebag. Papers. Sarah realized with a start. Military papers. "You know what these are?" Black Crow waved them mockingly. "Orders, written by your Captain Morrison, telling where Apache scouts should search, which camps to watch. Very helpful for avoiding army patrols." Sarah's mind raced. "How did you get them?" "From scout who thought gold worth more than honor. Not Nakai, he is too stubborn, too believing in white man's promises. But others, they learn what your people truly value." The sound of battle intensified. Sarah could see larger smoke columns now, black against the afternoon sky. Dust Rock was burning. "I tell you something. White woman," Black Crow continued. "Your people create their own enemies. You make us scouts, teach us your ways of war, then act surprised when we turn this knowledge against you. You break every promise, steal every sacred place, then call us savage when we fight back. You never. You helped Nakai, showed mercy, and for this, your own people turned on you." He laughed again. "This is the best joke. We don't need to destroy you. You destroy yourselves with hate and fear." A tremendous explosion echoed across the desert. The general store, Sarah thought numbly. Cal Van Morse kept gunpowder in the back room. Black Crow raised his lance. Time to go. My warriors grow impatient, and there is much work still. He started to turn his horse, then paused. You want to know something else funny? If your people had welcomed Nakai, helped him, he would have warned them. Would have told them Black Crow comes today. Not tomorrow, but they were too busy hating to listen. Wait, Sarah called out desperately. You said Nakai is a traitor to your people, but isn't this exactly what you're doing? Using knowledge gained from whites against other Apache who try to live in peace? Black Crow's face darkened. Peace? You call reservation life peace? Starving on bad beef and rotten grain while white men grow fat on our lands? He sawed his horse's head around. When your people want peace, they will have it. When they want war. He gestured toward the burning town. They have that too. The three warriors left to guard her grew visibly restless as the sound of battle shifted. One called out urgently in Apache. Black Crow nodded and raised his rifle skyward. Choose, white woman, he shouted. Stay in your cabin and live, or ride to town and die with those who would have burned you. See how much your mercy is worth to them now. With that, he fired his rifle, a signal. The three warriors whooped and rode hard toward Dust Rock, leaving Sarah alone with an impossible choice. She stood frozen for a moment, watching the war party disappear into the dust and smoke. Every instinct screamed at her to bar the door, to hide and wait for the storm to pass. The people of Dust Rock had come for her with torches and hate. Why should she risk anything for them? But then she thought of Doc Patterson, who'd finally stood up for what was right, of the children in the schoolhouse, of families who'd had no part in the mob's actions but would suffer just the same. Sarah ran for the barn, saddling her horse with shaking hands. As she swung into the saddle, she grabbed the medical supplies she always kept ready, bandages, laudanum, what little she had that might help. The ride to Dust Rock was the longest 3 miles of her life. The closer she got, the thicker the smoke became. She could hear screaming now, the crash of burning buildings, the fierce war cries of Apache warriors mixed with the desperate shouts of defenders. She crested the final rise and pulled up short, horrified by the scene below. Dust Rock was in flames. The general store was gone, reduced to burning rubble. The church, Samuel's church, had its roof ablaze. Bodies lay in the street, though in the smoke and chaos she couldn't tell how many. But the town was fighting back. She could see Sheriff McKenna and a handful of men fought up behind overturned wagons, firing steadily. A small group of soldiers, the escort that had brought Captain Morrison, held the jail, using its stone walls for cover. Women and children were streaming toward the schoolhouse, the only building not yet burning, and in the middle of it all, she saw him. Nakai. He shouldn't have been there. He should have been safe at Fort Buchanan, recovering from his wound, but there he was, standing between the Apache attackers and the schoolhouse, his rifle speaking steadily as he held the raiders at bay. Sarah spurred her horse down the slope, riding hard through the smoke and chaos. An Apache warrior loomed out of the haze, lance raised, but veered off when he saw her. A woman, unarmed except for medical supplies. Even in war, some codes held. She reached the schoolhouse and tumbled from her horse. Elizabeth Carver stood in the doorway, her face streaked with soot and tears, a kitchen knife clutched in her white-knuckled grip. You! Elizabeth's voice was raw with smoke and hatred. You brought this on us. This is your fault. Later, Sarah pushed past her. Where are the wounded? Inside, chaos reigned. Children huddled against walls while women tried to comfort them. Several men lay groaning on the floor, blood soaking through makeshift bandages. Sarah dropped to her knees beside the nearest, recognizing Tom Bradley despite the blood masking his features. A lance had caught him in the shoulder, tearing flesh and muscle. Easy, Tom, she said, already working to stop the bleeding. Stay still. His eyes focused on her with difficulty. Sarah, but why? After what we... Hush now. Save your strength. She worked with desperate efficiency, moving from wounded to wounded. Outside, the battle raged on. She could hear Nakai's voice raised in Apache, arguing with someone. Black Crow, she realized. Whatever he was saying, it was buying them time. Martha Fuller appeared at her elbow, face pale but determined. What do you need? Sarah glanced at her, surprised. Boiling water, clean cloth, anyone who can hold a bandage. Martha nodded and hurried away. Within minutes, a makeshift hospital had formed in the schoolhouse. Women who'd stood with the mob 2 nights ago now followed Sarah's orders without question. The crisis stripping away everything but the need to survive. A tremendous crash shook the building. Through the window, Sarah saw the church steeple fall, sending up a shower of sparks. Her heart clenched, so many memories reduced to ash. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fighting stopped. An eerie quiet fell over the burning town, broken only by the crackle of flames and the moans of wounded. Sarah peered cautiously outside. The Apache were withdrawing, Black Crow at their head. But they moved slowly, deliberately. Not like a defeated force, more like predators who'd eaten their fill and would return when hungry again. Nakai still stood in the street, rifle lowered but ready. Blood seeped through his shirt where his wound had reopened. As the last warrior disappeared into the desert haze, he swayed and fell to one knee. Sarah ran to him, arriving just as Sheriff McKenna and 2 soldiers reached his position. "Don't shoot," she commanded, throwing herself between them and Nakai. "He saved the schoolhouse, saved the children. He's one of them," someone shouted. "Probably led them here." "No," Captain Morrison's voice cut through the chaos. The captain limped up, one arm in a makeshift sling. "Nakai rode out alone when the attack started, against my direct orders and medical advice. He knew Black Crow would target the defenseless first." "Why?" McKenna asked, bewildered. "Why would he risk his life for people who wanted him dead?" Nakai lifted his head with effort. "Because someone has to break the circle. Someone has to choose differently." He looked at Sarah then, and she saw in his eyes the same thing that had driven her to help him, the desperate need to prove that mercy could triumph over hatred, that compassion could bridge the divide between peoples. Naive savage. Elizabeth Carver had emerged from the schoolhouse, but her voice lacked its usual venom. She looked around at the burning town, at the dead and wounded, at the Apache scout who'd stood between her grandchildren and death. Something shifted in her face, some certainty cracking like ice in spring. But before anyone could speak, a shout went up from the soldiers. Dust on the horizon again, but this time from the east, the cavalry, arriving too late to prevent disaster, but perhaps in time to prevent worse. As the wounded were gathered and the fires fought, Sarah knelt beside Nakai, working once again to stop bleeding that compassion had caused. Around them, the survivors of Dust Rock began the grim work of counting their dead and salvaging what remained of their lives. The attack was over, but Sarah knew the real battle, the one for hearts and minds, for the possibility of a different future, had only just begun. The dust had barely settled when Black Crow appeared again on the ridge overlooking the burning town. This time, he came alone, his war lance held high, feathers rustling in the hot wind that carried smoke and ash across the desert. The cavalry troops immediately formed a defensive line, but Captain Morrison held up his hand. "Wait," he commanded. "He's calling for parley." Sarah stood with the other survivors near the ruins of the church, her hands still bloody from tending wounds. Beside her, Nakai leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch, his face gray with pain but his eyes alert. "It's a trap," Sheriff McKenna said, checking his rifle. "Why would he want to talk now?" "Because he's made his point." Nakai answered quietly. "Look around. The town burns. People are dead. Fear runs deep. But he didn't destroy everything. He could have, but he didn't." Black Crow rode down slowly, stopping just within shouting distance. His warriors remained visible on the ridgeline, a reminder of the force still at his command. "I speak to the one called Nakai." Black Crow's voice carried clearly across the distance. "The scout who stands between 2 worlds." Morrison started to respond, but Nakai stepped forward. pushing away Sarah's restraining hand. I hear you, Black Crow. You disappoint me, cousin, Black Crow said, using the Apache term that could mean any relative or tribal member. You fight for those who would see us all dead or in chains. I fight for peace, Nakai replied, for a future where Apache children don't starve and white children don't grow up fearing shadows. Black Crow laughed, harsh and bitter. Peace, is that what you call this? He gestured at the burning buildings. Your white friends came to burn the woman who saved you. This is their peace? And this is yours? Nakai indicated the destruction. How many innocents died today? How many children are now orphans? Fewer than died at Camp Grant. Black Crow shot back. Fewer than starve on the reservation each winter. You want to count dead children? Cousin, I have been counting for years. The two men faced each other across the space between worlds, one in traditional Apache dress, the other in the mixed clothing of a scout. Sarah could feel the tension rippling through the crowd behind her. Soldiers fingered their weapons nervously. You think wearing their clothes makes you one of them? Black Crow continued. You think they will ever see you as anything but a tamed savage? Look how quickly they turned on the woman who helped you. She is their own kind, yet they would have burned her. What do you think they will do to you when you are no longer useful? Some will hate, Nakai admitted. Others will learn. Change comes slowly, but it comes. Change, Black Crow's voice rose. Yes, change comes. Our sacred mountains become their mines. Our hunting grounds become their ranches. Our children forget their names and speak only white words. This is your change. And your way, Nakai challenged. Endless war, fighting until the last Apache falls. Our people need a future, not just a glorious death. Better death than slavery. Better life than either. Nakai took a step forward, swaying slightly. You speak of the old ways, but the old ways included wisdom, knowing when to fight and when to talk, knowing that survival sometimes means adaptation. Black Crow studied him for a long moment. You truly believe this? That we can live alongside those who steal everything and give back nothing but promises written on paper that blows away? I believe we must try. Nakai said simply, because the alternative is extinction. Then you are a fool. Black Crow raised his lance. But perhaps a brave fool. I will make you an offer. Cousin, come with me now. Leave these whites to their burned town and their fear. Ride with true Apache once more. The offer hung in the air like smoke. Sarah found herself holding her breath, along with everyone else. If Nakai left now, after defending the town, it would confirm every prejudice, every whispered suspicion about Apache loyalty. No, Nakai said firmly. My path is chosen. Even knowing they will never truly accept you? Even then. Black Crow shook his head slowly. Then we are enemies. You and I, but I will say this. He raised his voice so all could hear. The scout Nakai fought with courage today. He stood between warriors and children. For this, he has earned single combat, if he wishes it. Let us settle this as men, not as white soldier and Apache, but as warriors. Gasps rose from the crowd. Single combat, an ancient tradition, but one that would end only in death. No! Sarah started forward, but strong hands held her back. She turned to find Doc Patterson gripping her arm. This is his choice, the doctor said quietly. His way of proving something to everyone, Apache and white alike. Nakai stood straighter, seeming to draw strength from some inner source. I accept. This is madness. Captain Morrison protested. You're wounded, exhausted. Captain, Nakai interrupted respectfully. This is necessary. If I refuse, every Apache will know I am a coward. If I die, at least I die with honor. If I live. He glanced at the assembled townspeople. Perhaps some minds change. Black Crow dismounted, drawing a long knife. Choose your weapon, cousin. Nakai unbuckled his gun belt, letting it fall. From his boot, he drew his own blade, shorter than Black Crow's but well-balanced. The two men began to circle each other in the space between the town and the ridge. Sarah had seen violence before, The frontier offered no shortage of it. But this was different. This was ritual, ancient and formal. The two men moved like dancers, each step calculated, each feint meaningful. Black Crow struck first, his blade singing through the air. Nakai twisted aside, but not quite fast enough. The tip caught his shirt, drawing a line of red across his ribs. The crowd gasped, but Nakai showed no reaction. Continuing his careful circling, they clashed again, steel ringing against steel. Black Crow was the stronger, uninjured and in his prime, but Nakai had trained with soldiers, learned their way of fighting as well as his own. He used his smaller size to advantage, staying low, making Black Crow reach. The fight ranged across the dusty ground, sometimes bringing them close to the watching crowd, other times carrying them toward the ridge where Apache warriors watched in silence. Blood marked their path, mostly Nakai's. Sarah noted with growing dread. Then Black Crow made his mistake. Confident in his strength, he overextended on a downward slash. Nakai rolled under it, came up inside Black Crow's guard, and drove his blade deep into the war chief's side. Black Crow staggered back, looking down at the wound in surprise. Blood flowed freely, darker than the war paint on his face. He pressed a hand to his side, then looked at the crimson staining his palm. "You fight, like both Apache and White," he said, his voice strained but oddly approving. "Perhaps that is what we become, not one or the other, but something new." He fell to his knees, and Nakai caught him, lowering him gently to the ground. The two men spoke quietly in Apache, words meant only for each other. Then Black Crow raised his voice one final time. "Warriors," he called to his men on the ridge. "I am beaten in fair combat. The scout has earned his choice. Let no Apache call him coward or traitor. He is what the future makes us. Different, but still." He coughed, blood speckling his lips. "Still Apache." His eyes found Nakai's. "Tell them," he whispered. "Tell our people. There must be another way. I could not find it, but perhaps you." Black Crow's hand fell limp. The war chief who had terrorized the territory, who had clung to the old ways with desperate fervor, was dead. For a moment, perfect silence reigned. Then, from the ridge, came a sound that raised the hair on Sarah's neck, a death song, haunting and beautiful, as Black Crow's warriors honored their fallen leader. One by one, they turned their horses and vanished into the desert. No more attacks would come today. Honor had been satisfied. A leader properly mourned. The immediate threat was over. Nakai stood slowly, Black Crow's blood on his hands. He swayed, and this time Sarah broke free from all restraints to reach him. She wrapped an arm around his waist, supporting him as his strength finally failed. "Why?" she asked softly. "You barely knew these people. Why risk everything?" He looked at her with eyes that held profound weariness. "Because someone must be first. Someone must prove it is possible, that Apache and White can choose differently, that we can be more than our fears make us." Around them, the townspeople stood in stunned silence. They had witnessed something none expected. An Apache defending their children, fighting his own kind for their sake, offering his life for people who had wanted him dead just days before. Elizabeth Carver was the first to move, the woman who had led the mob, who had preached hatred with religious fervor, walked forward slowly. Her face was streaked with tears and soot, her usual stern composure shattered. She stopped before Nakai and Sarah. "I was wrong," she said, the words seemingly torn from her throat. "God forgive me. I was wrong. You saved my grandchildren today. Both of you. You with your mercy. Him with his courage. I am ashamed." One by one, others followed. Not all. Some hearts were too hardened. Some losses too fresh. But many came forward with halting words of gratitude, of recognition, of shame for what they had almost done. Tom Bradley, his shoulder bandaged with Sarah's work, extended his good hand to Nakai. "I owe you a blood debt. My children live because of you." Sheriff McKenna cleared his throat roughly. "Seems the town of Dust Rock owes you both an apology, and more than that, our thanks." Captain Morrison stepped forward. Nakai, that was the bravest and most foolish thing I've ever seen. When you're healed, there's a promotion waiting. The Army needs men who understand both sides of this conflict. But Nakai's eyes were only for Sarah. And you? He asked quietly. What will you do now? Sarah looked around at the burned town, at the people who had threatened her and whom she had helped anyway, at the desert that held so much blood and possibility, both. Rebuild, she said firmly. Samuel always said the only way to fight darkness was with light. We'll rebuild the church, the school, the town, and maybe we'll rebuild it differently this time. Together? Nakai asked. And in that single word was a question about more than just reconstruction. Sarah met his gaze steadily, aware of the watching crowd, of the conventions being shattered, of the long, hard road ahead. Together, she agreed, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The survivors of Dust Rock began the long work of healing. The flames were dying now, but from the ashes, something new was struggling to be born. A future where mercy might triumph over fear, where understanding might bridge the gulf between peoples. It would not be easy. There would be setbacks, prejudice, those who could never forgive or forget. But in this moment, with Apache death songs fading into memory and sworn enemies standing side by side, anything seemed possible. The frontier was changing, one choice at a time. And sometimes, Sarah thought as she helped Nakai toward the makeshift hospital, that was how all great changes came, not in grand gestures, but in small acts of courage, in choosing compassion over comfort, in standing between hatred and its target, whatever the cost. The battle for Dust Rock was over. The battle for its soul had just begun. 6 months had passed since the flames of hatred had nearly consumed Dust Rock. Now, on a crisp October morning, Sarah Whitfield stood before the newly rebuilt church, its fresh pine boards golden in the sunrise. The scent of sawdust and paint still lingered, mixing with the desert sage on the cool breeze. "Higher on the left," she called to Tom Bradley, who was balanced precariously on a ladder, helping to hang the new church bell. His shoulder had healed well, though he still favored his right arm. "Woman, I've hung more bells than you've had hot dinners." Tom grumbled good-naturedly, but he adjusted the angle as directed. The sound of hammering echoed across the town, not the desperate construction of defenses, but the purposeful building of a community remaking itself where the general store had burned. A new structure rose, larger than before. Calvin Morse had reluctantly agreed to stock goods from the Apache reservation, creating a trading post that served both communities. "Sarah," a young voice called out, and she turned to see Mary Bradley running toward her, braids flying. Behind her came a group of children, white, Mexican, and, remarkably, 3 Apache youngsters from the nearby camp. "Mrs. Whitfield," Mary corrected herself, remembering her manners. "Nakai says to tell you the schoolhouse roof is finished. He wants to know about the windows." Sarah smiled at the girl who'd become an unofficial messenger between the various work crews. "Tell him the glass shipment should arrive from Tucson tomorrow. And Mary, walk, don't run. You'll scandalize Mrs. Fuller." Martha Fuller, who was directing the women preparing lunch for the workers, merely shook her head with fond exasperation. She too had changed in these months, her rigid proprieties softened by the shared trauma and rebuilding. As Sarah made her way to the schoolhouse, she reflected on the transformation. It hadn't been easy or unanimous. Several families had left Dust Rock entirely, unable to reconcile with Apache neighbors or forgive the attack. But others had stayed, and new settlers had arrived, people drawn by stories of a town that had faced its demons and chosen a different path. The schoolhouse stood on the same spot as the old one, but it was different now, larger, with real glass windows and a proper floor instead of packed earth. Most revolutionary of all, it would serve all children, a radical experiment that had nearly split the town again until Doc Patterson had gruffly announced that ignorance never helped anybody, whatever color they were. Nakai stood on the roof, directing the final placement of shingles. He moved with easy grace, his wounds long healed but their lessons permanent. When he saw Sarah, his face lit with the quiet smile she'd come to treasure. "It's looking wonderful," she called up to him. He climbed down, moving with the fluid economy of someone equally at home in both worlds he straddled. His clothing reflected this: cavalry pants and Apache moccasins, a cotton work shirt, and traditional silver ornaments. "The children will have proper shelter for learning," he said with satisfaction. "Both Apache and white ways. As we discussed, as we fought for," Sarah corrected gently. The school board meetings had been fierce, with Elizabeth Carver surprisingly emerging as one of the strongest advocates for integrated education. Her transformation remained one of the most dramatic, though she still struggled with old habits and occasionally lapsed into sharp-tongued criticism. "Mrs. Whitfield, Nakai." Sheriff McKenna approached, no longer wearing his badge. He'd resigned after the attack, saying a man who'd nearly let a mob burn an innocent woman had no business enforcing law. The town had elected him mayor instead, figuring his newfound humility might serve them better than his old certainty. "What is it, John?" Sarah asked, noting his troubled expression. "Riders coming. Military escort and others. Looks official." They gathered at the edge of town as the procession arrived. Captain Morrison led the group, but it was the man beside him who drew every eye. A distinguished Apache in a mixture of traditional dress and military decorations. Several Apache warriors rode behind him, faces painted but weapons sheathed. "Chief Naiche," Nakai breathed, recognizing the son of Cochise. "What brings such an honored leader here?" Naiche dismounted with dignity, his dark eyes taking in the rebuilding town. The Apache and white workers laboring side by side, the children playing together near the schoolhouse. His gaze lingered on Nakai, then moved to Sarah. "I come because word travels far," Naiche said in accented but clear English. "Word of a town where Apache and white people build instead of burn, where a woman's mercy and a scout's courage changed the path of hatred." He paused, his weathered face thoughtful. "I come to see if such stories are true or merely pretty lies told to make children sleep. See for yourself, honored chief," Sarah said, gesturing to the town. "We have much work yet to do, many wounds still to heal, but we try." Naiche walked slowly through Dust Rock, observing everything. He watched Apache women trading blankets at Morse's store, white children learning Apache words from their playmates, Tom Bradley and an Apache carpenter working together to frame a house. His warriors followed, suspicious and alert, hands never far from weapons. At the cemetery, Naiche stopped before two graves, Samuel Whitfield's weathered marker and a newer one that read simply, "Black Crow, Warrior." Sarah had insisted on the burial, over fierce objections, arguing that honoring enemy dead was the first step toward ending the cycle of vengeance. "You buried him with respect," Naiche observed. "He died with courage," Nakai replied. "Whatever else he was, he deserved that acknowledgement." Naiche nodded slowly, then turned to address the growing crowd. "I have seen many things in my years. I have seen promises broken and treaties torn like paper. I have seen my people's land stolen piece by piece, our children taken to schools that beat the Apache from them. I have learned to trust nothing from white mouths but lies." The crowd stirred uneasily, but Naiche raised a hand. "But I have also seen courage, not the courage of battle, which is easy for warriors, but the courage of change, which is hard for all people. This town has chosen a difficult path. Some of my people say you are fools. Some of your people say the same. Perhaps you are. But perhaps—" He looked directly at Sarah and Nakai, standing together despite the weight of different worlds on their shoulders. "Perhaps fools who dream of peace are wiser than wise men who see only war." He reached into his pouch and withdrew two items, an eagle feather and a silver medal. The feather he gave to Nakai, for the warrior who fights for tomorrow instead of yesterday. The medal he offered to Sarah. "From my time in Washington, meeting your president, I was told it represents hope, a white man's symbol, but perhaps fitting for a white woman who sees with Apache eyes. Sarah accepted the medal with trembling hands. "Thank you, Chief Naichi. But the honor belongs to all who chose to build instead of burn. Then all must guard what is built." Naichi warned. "There will be those on both sides who wish to see this experiment fail. Men who profit from hatred, who need enemies to justify their power. They will come with sweet words or sharp knives, with the laws or bullets. Be ready." As quickly as they had come, Naiche and his warriors departed, leaving the town to absorb what had just occurred. The blessing of Cochise's son was no small thing. It would bring legitimacy among the Apache that no government paper could match. That evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of amber and rose, the town gathered for the dedication of the new church. It had been rebuilt with lumber from both the sawmill and Apache-cut timber, its bell tower reaching toward heaven like a prayer for understanding. Sarah stood at the entrance, watching people file in, Apache in white, Mexican and Chinese from the railroad camps, all coming together in this place that had once burned with hatred. Not all were comfortable. She could see the tension in some faces, the careful distance maintained between certain families. But they came. Nakai joined her, now wearing his army dress uniform for the occasion. "Your husband would be proud," he said quietly. "I hope so." Sarah touched the medal at her throat. "Sometimes I wonder what he'd think of everything that's changed." "He was a man who believed in bringing people together," Nakai reminded her. "I think he would understand that sometimes God's plans take unexpected paths." Inside, Doc Patterson had agreed to lead the service, his newfound sobriety lending him a gravity that surprised everyone. His words were simple but powerful, speaking of redemption not just for individuals but for communities, of the choice between fear and faith. "We burned," he said, his gravelly voice filling the church. "We bled. We faced the worst in ourselves and in others. But from those ashes, we choose to rise different than we were, not perfect. Lord knows none of us are that. But trying, that's all any of us can do. Try to be better than our worst impulses. Try to see the image of God in faces different from our own." After the service, the town spilled out into the street where tables groaned under the weight of food. Traditional American dishes alongside Apache fry bread, Mexican tamales, and Chinese dumplings. Musicians struck up a tune, and tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, people began to dance. Sarah watched from the church steps as Tom Bradley awkwardly attempted to learn an Apache dance from one of Nakai's cousins, while Mary Bradley taught Apache children the Virginia reel. It was clumsy, sometimes uncomfortable, but it was happening. "We did it," Elizabeth Carver said, appearing at Sarah's elbow. The older woman's transformation remained startling, her iron-gray hair now often adorned with a beaded clip given by an Apache grandmother, her sharp tongue now more often turned toward defending the inclusive school than criticizing others. "We started it," Sarah corrected. "The real work is just beginning." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "And there will be setbacks. People will fall back into old patterns. New conflicts will arise. But," she gestured to the mixed crowd, to the children playing together without thought of the differences that had nearly destroyed their parents. "Seeds have been planted." As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself drawn to the edge of the celebration, looking out over the desert. Nakai found her there, as she'd known he would. "Regrets?" he asked. "No," she said firmly. "Questions, sometimes, worries about the future, but no regrets." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. Their relationship had deepened over the months of rebuilding, but remained undefined, something more than friendship but carefully respectful of the boundaries both recognized. In another time, another place, things might have been simpler. Here and now, they navigated carefully, aware that their choices affected more than just themselves. "Captain Morrison spoke to me today," Nakai said eventually. "There's trouble brewing further south. Renegade bands who see places like Dust Rock as betrayal. He wants me to scout, try to prevent another Black Crow situation." Sarah's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "When?" "Next week, But Sarah, he turned to face her fully. I'll be back. This place, what we're building here, it's worth protecting, worth returning to. She met his eyes, seeing in them the same mixture of hope and uncertainty she felt. Then we'll keep building while you're gone, and when you return, there will be more to protect. From the celebration came the sound of laughter, Apache and white mingling in the desert night. It wasn't perfect harmony, might never be, but it was a beginning. The church bell began to ring, not in alarm, but in celebration, its bronze voice carrying across the desert to wherever spirits lingered. In the cemetery, two graves lay side by side, a minister who'd preached love and a warrior who'd fought for the old ways. Different in life, they were united now in death and in the legacy their passing had created. From their conflict had come understanding. From their endings, a new beginning. Sarah and Nakai walked back toward the light and music, toward the fragile, precious experiment in humanity that Dust Rock had become. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the bonds being forged tonight. But tonight, under the vast Arizona sky, two peoples were learning to dance together, and that was miracle enough. The desert wind carried the sound of celebration across the empty miles, a message to all who would hear, here, in this unlikely place. Hearts had chosen hope over hatred. Here, the frontier was being reborn not in blood but in brotherhood. It was a small victory in an enormous struggle, but like all great changes, it began with individual choices. To heal rather than harm, to build rather than burn, to see in the other not an enemy but a neighbor. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer hopeless. And in Dust Rock, Arizona, that future had already begun. Thank you all for listening to this story of the Wild West, where love, mercy, and courage triumphed over hatred and fear. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts on Sarah and Nakai's journey. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to share more tales of the American frontier with you.